All right, so let's jump right into this whole voter ID thing. I mean, everyone's talking about it.
It's definitely a hot topic.
Oh, yeah, it's a big one, and it gets kind of confusing, I think.
Yeah, there are a lot of arguments flying around.
Exactly. So we're gonna take a deep dive, see if we can unpack some of those arguments for and against voter ID laws. Maybe clear up some of the confusion.
Sounds good.
So, I mean, we all kind of know what voter ID laws are at a basic level, right?
Yeah.
You need some kind of ID to vote.
Right, government issued usually.
But the devil's in the details, as they say.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like some states are super strict about what kind of ID you can use.
And others aren't quite as much.
And then there's the question of what happens to folks who can't afford to get an ID.
Right, that's a huge issue.
Yeah, it gets complicated quickly.
Absolutely.
So let's start with those arguments in favor of voter ID laws.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of folks start with this idea of election integrity.
Right, making sure that elections are fair and accurate.
Right. They say requiring an ID makes it harder for someone to pretend to be someone else at the polls.
Impersonating another voter.
Exactly. And we did see some research from the MIT election lab that suggests that even if voter fraud itself is pretty rare,
Which it seems to be statistically.
right, even the perception of secure elections can boost voter confidence.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, it's about public trust, right?
Definitely.
And it seems like there is a lot of public support for these laws.
There is, yeah. Pew had a poll. I think it was 72% of Americans support requiring photo ID.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, so, is it all about preventing fraud, though? Or is there something else going on there?
That's a good question.
Like, are there maybe some underlying anxieties about who votes and how it all works? And I think social media has definitely played a role here, especially sites like X.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Misinformation spreads so fast online, and it really shapes how people see these issues.
So it's not just about the facts, it's about how those facts get twisted around.
Exactly. And that's why you got to be careful what you read online,
Yeah. Oh, yeah, always double check those sources.
Absolutely. But let's get back to those arguments for voter ID laws.
Okay.
So besides public perception and election integrity, they also talk about the principle of it, fraud prevention.
Right. They say that even one case of voter impersonation is one too many.
Yeah, undermines the whole system.
Every vote counts kind of thing.
Exactly. But then the question becomes, does that justify potentially preventing eligible voters from casting their ballots?
Right. And that's a big concern for the folks who oppose these laws.
For sure.
They argue that voter fraud is statistically super rare.
It is especially the kind that voter ID laws are trying to prevent.
Right. And they point to research that says these laws could actually disenfranchise millions of eligible voters.
Especially those who already face barriers to voting.
We're talking about the elderly minorities, students, low-income folks.
Yeah, they're less likely to have the required ID and might have trouble getting it.
Like maybe they don't have transportation or can't get time off work.
Exactly.
It all adds up.
It does.
And even if they can get an ID, it often costs money.
Right. You've got the fees for the ID itself, plus maybe time off work transportation.
It's a burden.
It is, especially for folks who are already struggling.
Yeah, and that's a big part of the argument against voter ID laws.
Right. Are we solving a small problem by creating a much bigger one?
It's about balancing priorities, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
Election integrity versus the right to vote.
Tough question.
How do we even begin to reconcile those two things?
Well, that's what we're here to discuss.
Okay, good, because I'm already feeling a little lost.
Yeah, it's a complex issue.
It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where it gets really political, right? Voter ID laws, I mean, it's like everyone's got an opinion.
Oh, for sure. You can definitely see it breaking down along party lines.
Right, the Republicans are generally for it, Democrats against it.
Yep, pretty much.
And, it's interesting, we were looking at some of the stuff on X, and it's like these whole narratives about voter fraud and, like, election integrity, they just get amplified in these online echo chambers.
Yeah, that's how it works these days. Information or misinformation gets trapped in these little bubbles.
Right, and it affects how people see the world, even if it's not, based in reality.
Definitely, it shapes the whole conversation.
So it's almost like there are two conversations happening at the same time. One about, the actual facts about voter ID, and then another one about how those laws are being used as, like, political weapons,
It's hard to separate the two.
For sure. And then you've got all these legal challenges.
Oh, yeah. Tons of lawsuits.
Ever since that Shelby County v. Holder case.
Right. The Supreme Court really shook things up with that one.
Yeah, they struck down part of the Voting Rights Act. And it's like it opened the floodgates for all these states to pass stricter voting laws.
Especially those states with a history of voter discrimination.
And the lawsuits just keep coming. Some laws get upheld, some get struck down. It's a mess.
It's a constant back and forth.
The Brennan Center for Justice. They've been tracking all these cases.
Yeah, they've got a great database.
And it really shows you how complicated this whole issue is.
It is, yeah. And one of the big legal arguments against voter ID laws is that they violate the 14th Amendment.
That's the Equal Protection Clause, right?
Right. Opponents say that these laws put a bigger burden on minority voters.
Because they're less likely to have the ID.
Exactly, and it might be harder for them to get one.
So it's not just about whether the laws prevent fraud. It's about whether they're fair to everyone.
Exactly. Are we treating all voters equally?
Big question.
And the courts are trying to figure it out, you know?
Yeah, they're trying to strike a balance between protecting elections and making sure everyone can vote.
Not easy.
It's like this tug-of-war security versus access.
And there's no easy answer.
Nope. But we got to find one somehow, right?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it?
I guess so. I mean, what does it even mean to have secure elections? Is it just about preventing fraud?
That's a good question. What about all the other stuff that could go wrong?
Like what?
Like foreign interference, hacking, misinformation, campaigns. I mean, there's a lot out there.
Wow. And voter ID laws don't really address any of that, do they?
Not really. They're focused on this very specific type of fraud.
So maybe they're giving us a false sense of security.
It's possible, yeah. I mean, maybe we should be focusing on bigger threats.
Right. And maybe there are better ways to protect elections without disenfranchising voters.
Possibly. Yeah, there are a lot of smart people working on this issue.
So there's hope.
Hey, there's always hope.
Okay, so if voter ID laws aren't like the perfect solution.
They're going to be all and end all, yeah.
Yeah. What are some other things we could do? I mean, are there other ways to make sure people are who they say they are without needing a physical ID?
Well, there are some pretty interesting ideas out there.
Like what?
Like some countries are using biometrics, you know, fingerprints, iris scans, that kind of thing.
Oh, wow, like sci-fi stuff.
Yeah, kind of. But then there's also talk about using blockchain technology or digital signatures to verify voters.
That's pretty high tech.
It is, but it could be a way to make things more secure and efficient.
Interesting. But what about just making it easier for people to get IDs in the first place?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's a good point.
I read about one state that's sending like mobile DMV units to communities where people don't have easy access to government services.
Yeah, that's a great idea, being proactive about it.
And I've also heard some people talking about automatic voter registration.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Like when you interact with a government agency like the DMV, you're automatically registered to vote.
It would definitely streamline things.
And it would probably save people money too, right? No extra fees or trips just to register.
Yeah, that's a big part of it for sure.
And some folks have suggested waiving ID fees for low-income voters or letting them use a wider range of documents as proof of identity.
Yeah, those are good ideas too. I mean, it's about recognizing that not everyone has the same resources or faces the same barriers.
Right, it's not one size fits all.
Exactly.
So it seems like there are a lot of different solutions out there.
There are, yeah. It's a matter of figuring out which ones work best and which ones are the most fair.
But it all comes down to priorities.
Yeah.
Right? Like, are we more concerned about preventing fraud, even if it means some people can't vote?
Or are we more concerned about making sure everyone has a voice, even if it means there's a slightly higher risk of something going wrong?
It's a tough question.
It is, yeah, and it's a question we all need to be thinking about.
I think you're right. I mean, we need to understand the potential benefits of these laws, but also the potential costs.
Yeah, like how many people might lose their right to vote, and what does that do to our democracy? You know?
Right? It's about more than just numbers. It's about principles.
It is, and it's about having those tough conversations even when they're uncomfortable.
Because the future of our democracy depends on it.
It really does. I mean, we need to find ways to protect our elections and our right to vote.
Exactly. Both are important.
So as you keep learning about this issue, here's something to think about.
Okay. I'm listening.
What if instead of seeing voter ID laws as the only answer, we saw them as just one piece of the puzzle?
Okay, I like that.
Like, what if we focused more on making it easier for everyone to vote instead of making it harder?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, making it more accessible, more convenient.
Expanding access instead of restricting it.
Something to think about for sure. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.